Good evening, gentlemen. Good evening, fellow Jews, holy Jews. We are, in this class, in the middle of studying the second chapter of the Holy Tanya. The second chapter of Tanya, the first chapter of Tanya was concerned with something called the animal soul. Every Jew has two souls. The first chapter is about the first soul of the Jew. The first soul of the Jew is the soul that we experience most of the time. It is our biological vitality, our biological identity, and at its very root, it is defined by its separate existence from God. It's the I am that is at the core of our regular day-to-day identity, more or less. At the very core of our being is a spiritual I am that God creates, an I am that's separate from God. An I am as an independent ego, an independent consciousness, an independent awareness, independent identity. The second chapter of Tanya discusses how every Jew, believe it or not, because we don't experience this as often maybe as the other soul, every Jew has a second soul. This soul is an inheritance, a spiritual inheritance from our holy forebears, as we'll discuss later, from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That every Jew has a special connection with God called the godly soul, which is the second soul that the Jew has. And the godly soul is the exact opposite of the animal soul, where the animal soul says, I am, as an independent entity, as a separate existence from God. The godly soul says, I am, and the I is God, right? It's God saying, I am. The Jew's second soul is, as the famous first line of the second chapter of Tanya says, the Jew's second soul is literally a piece of God above. It's a part of God. And as we have discussed already now for multiple weeks, the idea of being a part of God means two things, two opposites at the same time. On the one hand, when you're part of something, it means that you share its traits, right? It means you're united with the thing. But to be discussed as a separate part means also that there's separation between you and the thing, right? To understand how these are both true at the same time and what we really mean by saying that the soul is a piece or a part of God above, literally. Last week we began to discuss three metaphors for this idea, three parables, three analogies that the Alter Rebbe is using, drawn from various sources and speaking to various levels, where the Alter Rebbe is explaining to us or trying to bring closer to our understanding what this divine soul is. That's what we've been discussing. Now, ideally, of course, I don't know if we mentioned this last week, but ideally, in Tanya, there's no repetition. The Alter Rebbe, the Tanya is a very precise work. And if the Alter Rebbe uses three metaphors, all three of them should really be necessary, right? I'm not sure if I myself fully understand that yet. We're working on it to try and understand why all three are unique and necessary. But in the meantime, we can at least list the three and try and understand what they say. The first metaphor for the soul being a piece of God comes from the idea of God blowing Adam's soul into him through his nose, as discussed in the book of Genesis, in the book of Bereshis, where it says that God blows into, like blowing up a balloon, right? He breathes and blows into the first man the breath of life. And what's interesting, as we discussed at length last week, is that everything else is created by God speaking. God speaks things into existence. God says, let there be light, and there was light. But when it comes to this description of Adam's soul, which, by the way, is the second description of the creation of Adam, inherently indicating that there may be two souls, by the way. That's a discussion for a different time. This description of Adam's creation of blowing, right, we understand is a metaphor. So when you have someone can speak, and last week I demonstrated it very clearly, that a person can speak at great length and not lose their breath and not become tired, right? You can speak and speak and speak. Whereas blowing, like blowing a balloon, the person becomes out of breath and uses up their energy much quicker. And the reason for this is because when you use your lungs to blow, you're bringing it up from a much deeper place. You're not just letting out air a little bit at a time. You're really forcing all the air out of your body, right? And this, of course, is the metaphor. It's a metaphor. It's an analogy describing the creation of this soul. Everything else that is in the creation, which creation means separation from God inherently, to an extent. Everything else in the creation is created by some divine action, which we compare to speaking, which is also a metaphor, of course. There is no actual voice that you could hear. If you had physical human ears there, you wouldn't have heard anything, right? There's some other action of God, which is called speaking. And then you have an action of God which is called blowing, and the implication is that it comes from a much deeper place. This is the first metaphor, right? To understand that the soul is a piece of God, because whereas everything else is created separate from God through the mode called speech, there's something that is separate from God in a sense, that becomes a creation, that becomes man, the first man, but on the other hand, comes from the depths of God's being. Whatever that means. The way that blowing comes from a deeper place than speaking does. Then we add a second metaphor. The second metaphor that the Alter Rebbe brings, and this is all in very few lines in the second chapter of Tanya, right at the beginning, 3 or 4 lines, you have all 3 of these metaphors. It's very terse, as the Tanya usually is. There's a lot packed into a few words. The second metaphor of the Alter Rebbe is from thinking, right? That whereas everything else is created as speaking, the soul comes from the wisdom, the mind of God. It's like a thought that broke off and became separate, right? And of course, this is a more subtle metaphor, because it's not describing the physical action of speaking and blowing. It's describing the spiritual action of speaking versus the spiritual action of thinking, right? Which are things that are at the interpersonal spiritual level, like I'm speaking to you right now. This is a spiritual act, right? It's not just, there's a physical component, of course, but no analysis of the physical components of speech can ever reveal the meaning that I am conveying with my words, right? If you just had the vibrations in the air, you wouldn't even know what was going on. It would be indistinguishable from noise and from gibberish, like it is to someone who doesn't speak English. The very fact that I can speak to you now, and my ideas, what I'm trying to express, is coming through the words that I'm speaking to you right now, right, is a spiritual act. You have a spiritual, my soul is communicating to your soul over a physical medium of speech. So anyway, the act of speech, obviously, is inherently an act of externalization, right? You only speak, hopefully, unless you're starting to lose it, you only speak to someone else, right? You speak to other people, not to yourself. You don't need to speak to yourself. It's not necessary most of the time. But the point of speech is to speak to others, externalized communication. Whereas, when it says, Yisrael olu b'machshava, Israel ascended in the mind of God before creation, right? This implies that the godly soul that's called Israel, right, is a part of God's thought, not his speech, which means that there's a thing that comes into creation which is not about God communicating or expressing himself externally, but is rather an internal, private expression of God that somehow ends up in the external world, our external world, which is outside of God, right? So it's like a piece of God that somehow belongs on the inside, but ends up on the outside, right? This is another metaphor for the godly soul. And the third metaphor, which we discussed right at the end of last week's class, which is really the metaphor that Tanya spends most time here discussing, is the metaphor of siring a son, right? Of the father's relationship to his son. Because as we explained, obviously, the son derives from the very essence of the father, right? And therefore, and even though he's totally united with his father, he also becomes a separate being in the son, right? And so this is the metaphor which we're going to explain much more about the godly soul. The godly soul relative to God is like his son. Now, what we touched on at the very, very end of last week's class is that really the second and third metaphor are, in a way, they're the same. They're not actually two separate metaphors. The second metaphor was that the godly soul is from God's thought. And the second metaphor is that the godly soul is like God's child, right? But really, as we explained at the end of last week's class, as we know from the Torah, and I think primarily from the Kabbalah, that the derivation of the Son, the place in the Father that the Son comes from, is actually the brain. Ultimately, spiritually, the root of the child is in the brain and the mind of the parent in particular. Of all the faculties of the parent that there are, we say that they come from the mind of the parent in particular, right? Which is something that we will discuss more as we go on. And so you see that having a son and having an idea that comes forth from and is externalized in a way are related. They're similar things, because the son is in a way the mind of the father externalized. That's what the Tanya teaches. If you're wondering what exactly that means, so we're going to discuss more what we mean by that connection. But that's what we discussed last week. And of course, it always pays to take a moment. We have discussed this previously in this chapter, but we should take a moment to acknowledge it again, that this whole idea of the godly soul is absolutely foundational to the Alter Rebbe's whole plan in how the Jew is supposed to get closer to Hashem. We explained in earlier classes that the Tanya is an answer to a question. The Tanya is not a work of general information, but is rather the very embodiment of the Rebbe, of the Alter Rebbe, addressing himself personally to your personal issue. And the general category of issue the Tanya addresses itself to is, how do I get closer to God? How do I live a godly life? Right? More or less, roughly. There's multiple components to that, etc., but that's the fundamental question. And the answer of the Alter Rebbe, any way you look at that answer, and there's many, it's a complex answer with many different parts and many different aspects, but any way you look at it, it's all about the godly soul. The godly soul is the key. The godly soul means, as we explained in a previous class, that the Jew's relationship with God does not have to be an external relationship, like I'm relating to you right now, at least at the conscious level that we're all in this room probably aware of, a caveat that will become important in chapter 32 of Tanya, which who knows what year we'll learn that in this class. The way that we are relating right now is externally, right? You're over there, I'm over here. I don't see things through your eyes. You don't see things through my eyes. And we are relating face to face, which means basically that we need a medium. Like I said before, that's why my words have to be conveyed by the air. Because fundamentally, right, if you and I saw through the same eyes, we wouldn't need to communicate. We would just be one, right? Because we're separate, we need a process called communication, which is building a bridge or a shared meaning or an objective reality between us. Now, the words objective reality to people who have been in these classes for the past few weeks should be like a big red flag, because in the first chapter, we explained that objective reality is of the Klippa, right? The whole concept of objective reality is a concealment of God. We don't believe that the baseline truth of everything is objective reality. It's not like you have reality and then inside of reality you have God and this table and this cup and me. Right? It's the opposite. The realist reality is subjective. The realist reality is the person of God, right, so to speak, right? It's God himself is the baseline reality. Within that reality, there's a bubble or an area or a self-contained realm, which is called objective reality, which is a concealment of the true reality of things. And this we call Klippa, or at least Klippas Noga, right? This idea of objective reality. It's the shell. It's the thing that's separated from God and thinks to deceive itself that reality is objective rather than divine, all of which we spoke about in the first chapter. So the whole idea of relating objectively, right, is to relate from a world that has already been distanced from God. Objective reality is something that God creates on purpose as something that's separate from him, right? So if you are existing in objective reality, which is where most of us exist consciously every day, we're walking around in an objective where things just seem to exist. That's what I mean by objective reality, right? Where things exist whether someone wants them to or not, or at least they seem to, right? They have their own reality. Like the famous saying goes, the facts are what remain the same when nobody speaks about them. right? Which is ironic because, of course, in Chassidus, all facts are derived from God's speech. So all facts are God speaking about them. But that's a whole other issue, right? The point for us here is that if a reality was objective, then God would be one thing. We would be another thing. And to relate, you'd have to build a bridge. And you can't really build a bridge between you and God, because God is infinite and you are finite, right? Now, some say the solution is I should stop being finite, right? Number one, Chassidus doesn't believe this is possible. Number two, more importantly, even if it was possible, Chassidus says this is the wrong thing to do. That's actually not the solution, right? That, in a sense, is rejecting the purpose of life. The purpose of life is not to become infinite. The purpose of life is to connect the finite and the infinite. So, theoretically, you have a terrible problem, because if I'm remaining finite, how can I build a bridge to the unending, infinite creator, right? You can't really. But the good news is that chapter 2 of Tanya, chapter 1 of Tanya explains the predicament that you're in, which is that you're separate from God, you're finite, and you can't build the bridge. Chapter 2 of Tanya tells you that secretly, like a hacker, like someone who breaks the official rules of reality, in a sense, right? We have what's called a back door to God, right? In computer science, you would call it a back door. What's a back door? A back door is a program you install on a computer that gives you access even when you don't go through the official channels. You don't have to log in the way everyone else has to log in, right? You've established access, right, from behind. You have secret access from a different direction than the way you're supposed to approach, right? So the secret is, in the second chapter of Tanya, that the Jew has built-in backdoor access to God. You don't have to build the bridge from the finite to the infinite, because in fact, where is God? He's not out there, he's actually in here. You don't have to go out, because the godly soul, which is a piece of God, is literally within you. So all you have to do is get in touch with, or reveal, or as my teacher Yeshiva used to say, you take out a little feather and give it a tickle, the godly soul, right? You have to give it a tickle so it wakes up, right? To give it with a feather. And the godly soul is an already existing connection with God. The secret of the second chapter of Tanya is that you never really became separate. Your animal soul became separate, but that's only half of who you are. There's another half of who you are that never became separate from God in the first place. And all of the solutions of Tanya, of how to live a godly life and how to relate to God, are all based on this fundamental truth. So it's very, very important. I wanted to put that in the review because we have to keep saying it. Otherwise, people find themselves, we get lost in the weeds and people say, why are we even learning this? This is why we're learning this, because you're going to see the progression is that through the godly soul, many, many things which otherwise would be impossible are actually possible in the relationship with God, and it's the basis for the way a Jew is, in a healthy Jew, is meant to relate to God. You're meant to use your godly soul. All right? Okay. Now, really, I didn't get to it last week. I didn't do everything I wanted to do in last week's class. But the fact is that unbeknownst to the students of the class, the end of last week's class, we actually ended on a somewhat difficult issue. There was a question we didn't get a chance to ask. But the fact is that we stopped at a question. The question is like this. All of our metaphors for the soul being a piece of God, right? None of these metaphors actually seems to say that the result is actually a piece of God. I'll say it again. The whole point of the three metaphors that we just reviewed, that the Alter Rebbe says, is to explain how the godly soul is a piece of God. But seemingly, as we say, the metaphor does not match the thing that it's trying to explain. Because none of these metaphors is actually a piece of it actually describes being a literal piece of the thing that you come from, right? A son is not literally a piece of the father in the sense that the soul is, right? It would seem. The idea is not literally a piece of the person that has the idea, right? You can give away an idea, you haven't given away literally a piece of yourself. You're still 100% whole when you share an idea, right, theoretically. So too, even blowing, the most physical of all the metaphors, right? It's still the air, right, that you're expelling, right, which is just it's just a slightly more intense version of speech, which is already an externalized process, right? I understand that the speech and the voice of the person is a pure expression of them, fine, but at the end of the day, what are you blowing when you blow? I understand it uses a lot of energy and it's only a metaphor, but at the end of the day, when you fill a balloon, it's not a piece of you in the balloon, yes? So, the question is, why are all of these metaphors going on things that are not literally a piece of the thing that produces them, right? That's the question. We're supposed to be explaining how the soul is a piece of God. None of these metaphors is really a piece of the thing. They're in fact all pieces of an external aspect of the thing, right? For example, a thought is a piece of your mind, not a piece of you, right? The sun is a piece of the person's capacity to create more life, it would seem, right? Not a piece of the person themselves. And so too, when you blow the air, obviously it's a piece of some kind of faculty where you can blow air. It's not actually a piece of the person themselves.
No, but in a way you can say that the sun is actually a piece. It starts with a little piece, but it grows. But in a way you can say things.
Sure, but the issue is that the piece, it's not clear in that metaphor of the sun, which is probably why it's not the only metaphor here. It's not clear in the idea of the son versus the father how the son is not truly separate. That's really the issue, right? The son metaphor is very good for becoming a separate thing from where you start, right? But it's not so clear how the result is really a piece of, right? Piece of means two things, right? Again, it means separates from, but is still a part of at the same time. So the son seems to be more of a focus on separate than a part of. And the other metaphors are much more a piece of something else, not of the person themselves, right? Yes?
Like it's much more. It's like, you put hot water on one person, the other one shouldn't feel it. It's the same thing. It was the same part, and they should have the same feeling. Like it is separated.
Sure. Absolutely. So clearly it's separate. So the question is how is it a part of, right? And things that are a part of, the question is how is it separate? But really all of these metaphors are separate. None of them is really truly a part of the person. A lot of the rest of the chapter is devoted to understanding this dynamic. The metaphors, what I'm saying in other words are, the metaphors are good metaphors, but you have to work to understand why they're good metaphors. Right? Why they're good metaphors is more complex. It's a little more complicated. So you have to pay attention and you have to really understand why these metaphors imply what the Alter Rebbe is saying they imply. Why they're good metaphors for being a piece of God. Right?
So maybe it's a reflection. Because in the moment, how you know there is a soul is the soul.
Yeah.
In the moment that you connect yourself to God,
in
the moment that they are connected to God, then you know there is a soul over there.
Right.
So maybe we're talking about the thing, it's actually a reflection of God. Maybe this reality is actually a reflection of God. Our reality.
Absolutely, at different levels and in different ways.
To explain a soul inside of us, we need first of all connect to the soul, connect to God, and then we reflect the soul.
Well, maybe that's an idea. Maybe we could even say to that idea, maybe that the Alter Rebbe is trying to help people, even people that aren't connected to it. Maybe you could even say. In other words, to someone who hasn't experienced the godly soul yet, we should at least be able to understand in theory what it is. But the question is this theory, if you're trying to explain to me with all these metaphors, in theory even what it is, right? So that when I see one day I'll recognize it maybe and know that that's what it is. the metaphors have to be accurate. So that's really the question. The question is if we're going to explain it in theory, maybe you're right, maybe the best way is just to experience it directly. But if we're going to explain in theory, right, rationally, what is this thing, right, then the explanation should be a good explanation. And our question is, going into today's class, is the explanations of the Alter Rebbe that he gives they all seem questionable. They all seem, it's hard to see the connection. So we're going to explain the metaphors more, that's all. So we are on the second chapter of Tanya. We are on page Vav of the Tanya in the Hebrew, which we are let's say 3 lines up from the narrow lines. That's where I would say we are in the Hebrew. In the English, we are in the second column on page 6, which starts, that is to say. The second column on page 6, third line, where we say, that is to say. That's where we're up to. Kamesha haben.
Oh, okay.
3 lines up from the narrow lines. Says the Holy Alter Rebbe, B'Lashon Harazav, in his beautiful, precise language, the Holy Alter Rebbe teaches, just as the son is drawn forth from the brain of the father, as we discussed last week. And by the way, as we mentioned last week, and I'll mention again, we don't mean that the son is literally drawn forth physically, in the physical sense from the brain of the father, but rather that the spiritual state of the father's mind affects the nature of the son. And we also explained that in general, interestingly, contemporary biology knows that the entire process of reproduction is dependent on the brain, and particularly the hormones, etc., that are released by various parts of the brain. Just as the son is drawn from the brain of the father, so too, in a manner of speaking, kaviyachol. Kaviyachol is a very important word. Kaviyachol means we're going to say something about God that really you can't say, but we're going to say it anyway. That's basically what it means.
Allegedly.
Kaviyachol, yeah. Allegedly. Kaviyachol means as if we were able to say, right? So when I say in English, so to speak, that's what I'm translating. Kaviyachol, you would say, is so to speak. We're going to say something that, right, as we say in general in Torah study, haretze litos yita, something like that. Right? Someone who wants to make an error, they're free to make an error. In other words, if you want to be stupid and read this in a stupid way, where no one's going to stop you. But that's the warning. The warning is kaviyachol. So that's like the hazard sign, right? The Alter Rebbe is saying, I'm going to say something that if you wanted to intentionally read this in a foolish way, you are totally open to do so, because we're going to say something that you're not really supposed to say. That's what kaviyachol means. Kaviyachol, so to speak, as if we could say such a thing. Right? So, let me start at the beginning of the sentence. Just as the son is drawn forth from the brain of the father, kach kaviyachol, so to speak, nishmas kolish Yisrael, nimshcha b'machshavtei v'chachmaso yisbarich. The soul of every Jew is drawn forth from the thought and wisdom of God. And as we're going to see, the Alter Rebbe means this extremely literally. Right? The so to speak is on the comparison to the physical process, right? The comparison to the physical process, you can only say kaviyachol, right? Because obviously the way that a soul comes from God is only very tenuously and in a very abstract way at all like the way that a son comes forth from a father, literally in the physical world, right? However, when the Alter Rebbe says that the soul comes from God's wisdom, he means this quite literally. He means, as we're going to see, and it will take us probably a few classes to get there, the Alter Rebbe means there is something literally called God's wisdom, and the soul literally derives from that place, right? And I'm just going to point out that this is again the same issue as before. I thought the soul was meant to be a piece of God. Why are we saying it comes from this thing called God's wisdom? That's the question. Right? Why? I thought the soul. We started the chapter 10 lines ago and said the soul is a piece of God. Now we're saying the soul comes from God's wisdom, whatever that is, right? Which at the moment is just words. So you could say it comes from a giraffe for the same price. What do we mean? It comes from God's wisdom, right? And the question is why? What does that mean? I thought that it comes from God Himself, right? So the Alter Rebbe now goes on and addresses this question at great length. The Iyu Chakim v'loy b'chachma yediyah. He is the one who knows, but not with a knowable knowledge. Ela hu v'chachmasai echad. Rather, he and his wisdom are one. That's the answer to the question. The answer is that when you say the soul is a part of his wisdom, it's like saying it's a part of God, because God and his wisdom are one. Now, this sounds like a nice answer, but this nice answer raises a whole bunch of questions that we didn't have before. Now we have new questions, such as, number one, what does it mean God and his wisdom are one? Number two, if God and his wisdom are one, why don't I just say it's a part of God, right? What does it help me to say it's a part of his wisdom if God and his wisdom are one, right? Why am I emphasizing that it's part of his wisdom, right? Now, you could answer the second question and say, well, it helps the metaphor, right? Because it helps us understand metaphorically that just as the Son comes from the mind of the Father, which is already something that has to be understood quite abstractly, right? Then so too, metaphorically, is the soul coming from God's wisdom, right? The mind of God, so to speak. However, as we're going to see, it's not just for the purpose of the metaphor, it is actually much more involved and precise. It's exactly what the Alter Rebbe wants to say. It's not just a method of explaining it. It is, in fact, the actual reality, the actual facts of the matter, which, again, we are going to explain at great length, that, in fact, the soul derives from God's wisdom. Now, what do we mean when we say he is wise but not with a known wisdom, right? Which sounds like a contradiction, and maybe it is a little bit.
I think it's a very nice explanation about this one. This is one of the tchonot of the characters of Mashiach, that he knows, but he didn't learn to know. And what does it mean? All of the thing of Mashiach is actually that he judged by the smell. And the smell is something that we don't need to learn. Like even if a child, he didn't go to school, he's going to go by a dead animal, he's going to feel the smell and he's going to reject it. That's like something that comes obvious without learning.
So it's an instinct.
Yeah.
But the problem is that this means that God's wisdom is extremely yadua. In fact, it's more yadua than wisdom itself. Because wisdom itself, you start learning when you're 3 years old, but smells you start learning when you're 2 days old. So in fact, everyone knows it. Not only is it not known, not only is it not known, it's in fact the most widely known thing that there is, right? We're saying in a sense the opposite, right? Because you're saying it's not wisdom. Here we're saying almost the opposite in a way. We're saying it is wisdom, but it's wisdom that's not known. Right? Lo b'chachma yediyah, right? It's chachma, right? Chakim, chakim means he does the action of wisdom, which there's no real English word. You would say he is wise, I suppose, which is adjectivizing the actual word. Right? He wises, yeah.
It depends on the case.
1 second, I didn't finish, I'm in the middle of a sentence. He wises, v'lo b'chachma yediyah, but not with a known form of wisdom. Yes?
Is that right? He exists, but not by our definition of existence.
It's actually very similar. Very good connection. We'll get into that shortly. He said, is it like he exists, but not our definition of existence? In fact, it is very much like that, as we're going to discuss. Yes, you were saying? Yes, very, very similar. Very similar. Very good. Very good. Excellent assessment. We've actually spoken about all of this before multiple times. We just get into it through different ways and in different words. But in fact, for this class, this is an old topic. we've discussed a lot of this before.
I remember.
We're going to discuss it. So, like Rabbi Akiva said, water on a rock, right? We're going to discuss it. We're going to discuss it more. That the Holy Torah can penetrate all of our minds with enough repetition. Right? So. We learned when we learned the second part of Tanya, which by now is a long time ago. We learned when we learned the second part of Tanya that the Alter Rebbe writes there that God and His wisdom are absolutely one, which is why we know for a fact that His wisdom is unknowable, right? Because He's unknowable. So if He's unknowable and His wisdom and Him are absolutely one, right? It makes sense that His wisdom is also unknowable. This still doesn't explain why it's called wisdom, right? It's called wisdom, but in matter of fact, if you saw God's wisdom, you would not see that it was wisdom at all. In other words, if God's wisdom was placed before you, right, you would be as likely to think that it was anything else than wisdom. You could think it was kindness. You could maybe you would even think it was some other being of some kind, right? What? The Torah is God's wisdom, absolutely. So if the God's wisdom was placed before you, if you knew the Torah, right, you wouldn't even think of it as wisdom. You wouldn't even know what it was, right? Which tells us what we know. But that's a discussion. The Torah is a special case. We'll get to the Torah later. Chapter 5 is about the Torah. We'll talk about the Torah so much you'll be sick of it. You want to move on. So you want to move on to Klippa, which is chapter 6, which is funny. But the leave Torah out of it, because the case of the Torah is a special case. We'll talk about Torah a different time. God's wisdom is as unknowable as God is, fundamentally, right? The question is on the Torah, so how do we know what we know of Torah? Which is a good question. That's the question. But that's a separate issue for a different time, right? Fundamentally, and really the way you should think of the Torah in truth, right, is that be'etzem, in truth, the Torah is essentially unknowable, right? The fact that you know anything is the chiddush. The fact that you know anything is the innovation. That's the miracle. Right? By nature, the Torah is unknowable in truth, right? But that's a discussion, again, we're not going to get into that. The Torah we'll discuss later. So God's wisdom, whatever it is totally united with Him and totally unknowable as a result. Is resultantly totally unknowable because God is totally unknowable. Now the Alter Rebbe quotes the Rambam. He quotes Maimonides. Maimonides describes, and it's interesting because it's one of the things that the Rambam says in all of his major works, right? A lot of things that the Rambam says, he says in only one of his books, for example, right? This is something that the Rambam said in pretty much every major book that he wrote in one form or another, which means it's from the philosophical work of the Guide for the Perplexed. It's from the commentary on the Mishnah, the famous commentary on the Mishnah. And it's also from Mishnah Torah. It's from the book of Jewish law, right at the beginning, right? The Alter Rebbe says as follows. Let's just read the Rambam. Did I say the Alter Rebbe? The Rambam says as follows. The Alter Rebbe quotes him, right? And the Alter Rebbe is attaching it to this idea that God's knowledge is unknowable, right? So we're going to read it, and then we're going to take a step back and explain all of this from the ground up. And that's basically what the rest of tonight's class is going to be, God willing. First of the narrow lines of the Alter Rebbe. Rambam, as the Rambam writes, and for those following in the Hebrew, you'll see there's an asterisk. The asterisk is to the footnote, which we are inexorably working our way towards, the famous footnote of the Alter Rebbe on the second chapter of Tanya, which we'll get there. Rambam, as Maimonides writes, Shehu, that God is Hamada Hu Yedeya Hu, that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the thing that's known, etc. This is something that a human being is not able to understand clearly, says the Rambam. This is something that is beyond human comprehension. As the verse says, will someone who investigates God find him? Right? In other words, as a question. Obviously not. You cannot investigate your way to God, which is a different way of saying that God is not the answer to any argument. He's not something that's ever been proved. He's not something that's the result of an intellectual excursion, all of which is very interesting because the Rambam in some places seems to be doing exactly those things, and it's a question that's bothered many people for a very, very long time, and it will make it so that it bothers us as well by the time we get to the footnote. Okay, what's going on here? We had two things. We have two statements. The Alter Rebbe, number one, says God's wisdom is not a known wisdom, right? Which we noted is because God's wisdom is absolutely one with him, right? Then the Alter Rebbe says this is spoken about by Maimonides, by the Rambam, right? The Rambam, of course, lived many centuries before the Alter Rebbe. I want to say 6 centuries-ish, maybe a little less, before the Alter Rebbe, before the Tanya. And the Rambam writes that God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at once. This is beyond the human intellect to comprehend. What does this mean? We've spoken about it in this class multiple times, but the times are so separated over across the eons of our class and all the different texts that we've learned before, right, that sometimes we forget. So let's do a refresher on the whole concept all the way from the beginning. Yeah? At this point, we're probably going to take some diversions and get lost, but it's okay. In other words, we'll, at the end of this discussion, however long it might be, I'm not sure if this discussion will end tonight, but at the end of this discussion, we're going to bring it back and tie it all back into the Tanya. So don't worry if you don't immediately see the end of this, see your way out of this discussion. I've got you. So you can just be what we're discussing right now. And afterwards, we'll summarize and plug back into the Tanya, right? So, but we're going to go far afield for a little while. There's 2 ways of knowing things about God. One way is God tells you. The other way is you figure it out on your own. In Judaism, these 2 ways you could call Kabbalah, which is God telling you. The word Kabbalah means literally received wisdom, right? In other words, I didn't figure this out on my own. This is something I received. It's Kabbalah. And for everything else that the Kabbalah is, and all the complicated things, and the red strings, and Madonna, and all the spiritual worlds, Lahavdil, and everything in between, what Kabbalah is at the end of the day, at the very core of Kabbalah, is received wisdom. That's what the Kabbalah is. That's what characterizes the Kabbalah. It sounds so simple for something that's theoretically so complicated, but in fact, all of that complication is all just a manifestation and riffing on the notion of received wisdom. God tells you about God. The other path, which is called you figure it out on your own, so to speak, is called chakira, is called philosophy, right? Philosophy means, in the Jewish context, some people would define philosophy as all things that we can know, right? But this is not true, because when we say philosophy in this class, we mean chakira, which means the Jewish tradition in philosophy, right? Which is a very classical, old school definition of philosophy, which means working in the context of knowing about God, which means acquiring wisdom from the bottom up, right? In other words, without God's help, right? The Hebrew word chakira, as in the Chikre Yisrael, the Jewish philosophers, the word chakira means investigation. It's That's literally what the word means. And ironically, it's the very word that the Alter Rebbe uses in this verse that he just cited. Hacheker Eloka Timtza. Will someone that investigates God be able to find him? Right? And the answer is no, they won't. So the question is, so why do investigation then? We'll get to that. But first, let's set aside the Kabbalah for a moment. We'll get back to the Kabbalah. God telling you about himself, right? Let's assume that, God forbid, there is no such thing, right? Let's assume for a moment that you work your way towards God with your own tools. God didn't tell you about himself. You had to know about God yourself. This is something that in its own way is very Jewish. Where in Judaism do we find it? Very good. Eyal said, Abraham did it, right? Because Abraham discovered God all by himself, right? So the real, in truth, as people who have attended these classes for a long time know, I've said it before, the real philosophical period in Judaism was from the time Abraham was 3 to the time he was 48 or something like that. That was the philosophical period of Judaism. Right? There was only one Jew at the time, but whatever. That was the philosophical period of Judaism. So what we call the Jewish philosophers, when we're talking about the Middle Ages, which is thousands of years later, right? With Maimonides, and before him you had the Rav Sadia Gaon, and you have the Kuzari of Rav Yehuda Levi, you have Rav Chizday Kreskas, and you have Rav Yosef Albo, and all of the Jewish philosophers. You have Ibn Gavriel. Street in Tel Aviv. I met him first as a street in Tel Aviv. Only afterwards I found out he's a Jewish philosopher. You too. You have Ibn Gavriel, right? All the famous Jewish philosophers of the Middle Ages, right? They missed the window on the true Jewish philosophical period, which was during the time of Abraham. Since then, Judaism has never been a philosophical religion. So you could ask, what are all these great rabbis in the Middle Ages doing philosophy for? That's a different question for a different time. You have philosophy. You're like Abraham. We actually have a little bit of Abraham's process recorded in the Midrash. The Midrash discusses a little bit Abraham's philosophical process. We have interesting things from him. We have his discussions with Nimrod, right, which were really kind of like a debate, which was very interesting because Nimrod said he was God, and Abraham had all of these questions that he asked Nimrod to show that Nimrod isn't God, which is quite fascinating. And then you have other things like the famous discussion about how Avraham noticed that the wind pushes the clouds, so the clouds can't be God, the wind must be God, but then the wind can't push the mountain, so the mountain must be God, right? But then the mountain is worn down by water, so water must be God, right? And all of these sort of investigations. You have the famous statement of the Midrash right at the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha and Midrash Rabbah, which discusses the Abraham sees the tower that's either lit up or on fire. There's two different ways you could translate it, and he says, is there no master to this tower, right? And then God shows up and introduces himself to him, which is later, that's the Kabbalah half, right, of the Revelation. So there is a traditional Jewish philosophy going back all the way to the first Jew, right? That there is a God in the eyes of Chassidus, I've told you this before as well, I'm nearly certain. The idea that God exists, which the world finds so controversial and so one of the great debates of all time, Chassidus views this whole matter as quite trivial. Chassidus does not see this as a Chassidus barely discusses this issue. Does God exist? Chassidus is you could even say, maybe it's probably disrespectful, but you could probably say Chassidus is bored by this issue. What?
It's obvious.
Yes, well, in the eyes of Chassidus, I don't know if obvious is the right word. The answer is not necessarily obvious. The answer is trivial. In other words, what's the difference between obvious and trivial? Obvious means that the answer to the question is just, there really is no question, right? It's just so blatantly obvious that there is a God, right? I would say it's slightly more subtle than that. It's not necessarily that the answer is so obvious. It's that finding the answer to this question is not going to solve any of the problems that you think you're solving by asking it. Right? In other words, almost no one, can't be totally categorical, but almost no one who asks this question, right, is asking this question. This question is a question that's in place of, that we can understand enough to ask, in the place of other questions. Chassidus doesn't find the question of the existence of God to be so relevant. So Chassidus finds, in fact, that the existence of God is something that can be known quite simply, right? And Chassidus says it can be known quite simply even from philosophical grounds. In other words, not because of revelation, right? It's quite logical. Right? And there's multiple ways you can do this. You could use which the Rebbe did quite often in letters. The Rebbe would write often some version of what's known as the Arguments of the Kuzari by Rav Yehuda Halevi, who discusses the mass revelation at Sinai, which is really the unique calling card in terms of the tradition of Judaism that no other tradition possesses. Right, which is the idea that the mass revelation of God to hundreds of thousands of people all at the same time, and that becoming a living tradition that is recounted every year at the story of Pesach and the Haggadah, and it would be impossible to start such a tradition unless it actually happened. And you can go and read the Kuzari and the Rebbe's letters, and you can go see the whole argument laid out there. Or you could go from a much more broad angle and make it not even about Judaism. You could make it any of the traditional philosophical arguments which people have tried to hand wave away, but which really at the end are actually quite strong, right? In other words, the simple answer of how do you know God exists, of, well, where does everything come from, is actually quite a good answer, right? Obviously, it's a little more complicated than that, but the core of this answer is actually quite good and quite robust and quite defensible. Right? The reason Chassidus would tell you, I believe, the reason people don't accept any of these answers has nothing to do with their rational cogency or not, right? Which is a different way of saying you weren't looking for the answer to the question. The answer to the question at a rational level is not what you were looking for, which is why you can hear the answer can make sense, it makes 100% logical sense, and you don't care. It doesn't matter at all, right? It's not what you're really looking for. Anyway, that's the whole spiel on the proving of God. The proving to get to the existence of God is relatively trivial. The real question begins, the real philosophy begins in Judaism, right? Not when you have a God. The real philosophy is trying to understand the nature of the God that you have, right? What do we mean by this? What do we mean by this? We'll put it in the language Chassidus would use, because this is a Chassidus class. Everything that exists is made up of parts, just about, right? Let's put it this way. Everything in our direct experience that we know directly, right, is made up of parts. Chassidus would say, right, that if you break it all the way down to the most basic, everything that we know has to have at least two aspects, right? At least two parts, right? There's division in everything. There's duality in everything. Why? Because everything is at least two things. There's what it is in itself, right? And there's its relationship to its source, yes, to where it came from. Because everything came from somewhere or something in some way, right? Everything that we experience, right, is like this, right?
Unlike Ein.
What?
Unlike Ein.
I don't know what that means. So if you have two things, if everything has two aspects, right, then you could ask very simply, what makes it one thing then? Right? If everything has two aspects, what makes it one thing? And the answer is that it doesn't really matter what makes it one thing. You can choose anything in the world that makes it one thing. Obviously, it's some kind of rational process where we determine that these two things are connected in some way, and therefore we treat them as one thing, right? That's why we don't talk about the table and the table's relationship with its source. We just talk about the table, and it's understood that even though the table does have a relationship with its source, right? Nevertheless, we just talk about the table, right? Of course, with things that are as obvious as physical objects, they obviously have many parts. You don't even need the relationship with the source, right? They're obviously made up of many things together, right? So in other words, you need a third thing to explain why these two things are united together, right? If you had an object which is made of multiple pieces, you would say that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. There's some explanation, right, which makes this whole thing into a table rather than just a collection of molecules. Because if it was just, for example, a collection of molecules, the air a foot above the table is also just a collection of molecules. So what separates the table from the air that's a foot above the table, right? And it doesn't matter what answer you give. Whatever the details are, you could say it moves differently, it behaves differently, it has different qualities. You could say those qualities are physical, you could say the qualities are spiritual. It doesn't really matter, right? Whatever the third thing is that is now acting to explain, right? So it's whatever the principle is or the idea is. If you investigate that thing, you will find that it also has parts, right? It's also made of parts. So you need a fourth thing, which explains the third thing, right? But if you investigate this fourth thing, you'll also see that it's made of parts, right? Bingo, bango, bongo, magically you find that in order to explain anything, right, you need something that is not made up of parts at all, right? And you can call provisionally this thing which has no parts at all, which is at the bottom, right, which explains all of these other things, but it itself has no parts, right? You call that thing God. Right? As a proposal, there must be something that has no parts, right? Because otherwise, what explains why all of these other things, which are made up of all these parts, are each one thing, right? And you can't use the most obvious answer, because the most obvious answer is also made up of parts. So it itself needs an explanation, right? At the bottom, you arrive at something that is not made of parts at all. And you find very interesting things about the thing that's not made up of parts. For example, if something is made up of no parts, right, there can only possibly be one of them. Because all other things are separate in terms of the lacks and relationships between their parts, right? That's actually what separates the table from the air that's a foot above the table, right? Is that in some way the table has some aspect which is different from the air. So it has aspects, which means it has parts. If it has one aspect, then it must have another aspect, right? A way in which it's not that aspect. That's what the word aspect means, right? So you find that the thing that has no parts has to be only one of them, right? And it has to be infinite, because all finite limitations in effect create parts, right? Because in one sense you'll have, if something is found on a line between north and south, you can always have, it's like the famous Yiddish expression that every stick has two ends, right? So if something is found in any physical space or with any bodily form at all, in any form of finitude, right, then you could say it has an upper part and a lower part. There's two different ways of approaching it, right? So this thing must only be approachable in one way, right? There's no multiple ways to approach it. So it has to be absolutely simple. There has to be absolutely one. There can only be one of them. It has to be effectively infinite is what we're saying, right? It starts to sound like this thing is God, right? You see how trivial that is, and you see how little it solved everything in your whole life. It didn't solve anything, right? So it's absolutely true. It's basically completely defensible. It's completely rational, and it helps nothing. So you see, this is why Chassidus doesn't spend a lot of time on it. Anyway, because the problem that you had was not that you never had this incredible presentation by Rabbi Tzvi to explain to you that God exists. That was not the problem in your life before tonight. Yes?
That's the point.
Yeah.
First of all, we are trying to teach a blind man the color red.
Not exactly.
I'll continue because that's good. We are trying the entire idea of connection to God and revealing the relation of God.
Yeah.
Which God for me is a guy with a hat, a magician who picks up things and put a reality from one dimension to the other dimension. That's for the parts. The parts exist in a different dimension. We just pick it up from that dimension over there, from the hat, and put it in reality over there.
And therefore,
and the same thing, the idea of God. The idea of God that we're trying to explain to a majority of people, that blind people, the color red. For you to see the color red, for a blind man to see the color red, for a blind man to believe in a God or to feel a God, you need to have the both eyes.
Right.
I call the both eyes in human beings, it's a chip that is connected to the divine. What we need to prove, we don't have to be proved that God exists. We need to connect ourselves to that chip.
Absolutely
to be
true.
Connected to that source of power.
I agree with you 100%.
And then we talk in a different dimension.
I agree 100%.
Then it's not magic anymore to pull up. Then God is not a magician to pull up.
I agree. Well, 1 second. I agree 100%. But
the problem.
I agree 100%. I agree with you. What you're saying is 100% right. We agreed. We made a blood pact We all swore on the Quran. No, we didn't do that. We all promised that we were going to be having this discussion as if God is inaccessible, right? As if there is no access to God, right? We're going to be working towards it from the bottom up. There's a reason for this. There's a reason we're discussing it this way. So you're right, but you stepped outside of the rules that we set for this conversation at the moment. 1 second, we'll see. We'll see why we're...
What do you mean he stepped outside the rules?
The what?
What do you mean he stepped outside the rules?
Because he's talking about a personal relationship with God. We are having a discussion as if, like philosophers, from a philosophical aspect, which starts with the assumption, right, which I said before, we're assuming that there is no personal relationship with God, right? We're working towards him, right? Like, for example, like Avraham Avinu did, right, once upon a time. Avraham Avinu was raised by idolaters. He had no concept of God, right? And God never spoke to him until later, right? And he had no inner access to God that we know of, right? At the beginning, when he was a very young child, right? He was just asking questions and using his seichel, right? So we are proceeding in a similar way right now for a reason, just for a little while. Pardon me, we changed the time. Someone remind me what time this class started?
Never mind, that's confusing.
20 minutes ago.
6:30.
Never mind, don't work the time.
The trick of moving the clock was easier in the days of the Alter Rebbe when it was a wind-up thing.
It's a sin for you to come and sit this class and we're going over here and then tell time to cut it out.
All right.
Brings us back to
So
reality.
let's continue a little bit further. So that's a proof of God. In a totally classical, I said it in simple English, but it's pretty much a totally defensible, totally rational, very ancient demonstration that God exists. Not so different from what Abraham did himself. It's very similar to the idea of the water washes down the mountain, so the water must be God, but the water can't be God, right? It's the same style of demonstration.
I got a question.
Yeah, please.
So, like you said, like,
Yeah.
talking about like how God is like 9 parts.
Yeah.
You're saying, oh, like the mountain. So if the wind can't pull the mountain,
Yeah, yeah.
must be God. But like from how I understand it, like everything is God. Like every little thing is God. Every good thing, every bad thing, it's all an extension of God. Because everything is God. The universe is God, after all. So, you know what I mean?
You bring up a good point. The point that was brought up, I just repeat it sometimes for the people online. The point that was brought up is that isn't everything God in a way? And the truth is that we agree, but the sense in which this is true, in which everything is God, you have to be very careful in understanding what that means exactly. So we're in the process of understanding what that means, and we'll get to that. We'll get to that point in this class. That is a goal. So what you bring up a very good point, which is that isn't everything really God? We're going to get to that. We're working our way towards that. We are starting with something relatively very simple, right? And we're going to work our way towards that. So fundamentally, so in other words, that's one description of God. But that one description of God is not the description of God who is explaining how the table can have many parts, right? Now we're going to get to how can there be different descriptions and what does that mean, and we're going to get to that. So let me just get back into that very narrow, this procedure which we're doing for a reason, right? So you get to this being called God. All of the traditional proofs of God work this way, by the way. For anyone who's familiar with any of the ancient proofs, like the Rambam discusses, like all the Jewish philosophers discuss, right? They're all in a very similar vein. They're all in a very similar type of thing, right? You can't explain the unity of things as one thing if they're made of parts without God. Or you can't explain how things move, right? Which is the classic demonstration of Aristotle, although what he meant by move is something more profound than what we would think the word means, but that's a separate thing. And that's the one that the Rambam spends a lot of time with as well, because the Rambam based a lot of his philosophy overtly. He speaks about Aristotle. He quotes from Aristotle. Then you have there's other ones as well, but they all follow more or less this same thing, which is that this thing that is the effect required a cause of some kind. But I see intellectually that cause itself requires another cause. And this stretches all the way back, right? And there's different ways it can stretch back. It can stretch back logically, it can stretch back in time. There's all different ways you can construct these arguments, which are fascinating. But they all are roughly the same. So they all have to end on something that doesn't have this property. It's not made up of parts. It doesn't move, right? Or whatever the argument may be. So this thing that we're calling God must exist in order to explain the thing that I have in my regular experience. That's the gist of these arguments, right? In other words, what this argument is theoretically saying is I cannot really fully understand this table unless God exists, right? And that's why I need him to exist, to explain this table, right? This is a philosophical approach to God, right? And you have all of these different truths that must be true about the God that I arrived to through this argument. Yes, more or less. It's very like on one leg. That's the summary. So, one of the problems, now this whole explanation immediately runs into all sorts of problems. And most of Jewish philosophy that's about God is figuring out and working through these problems and trying to find solutions to these problems. One of the problems you run into immediately is the following issue. We have this God who has no parts, who is totally one, who's totally infinite, and he's the explanation for everything. Fine. However, we know in Judaism, right, and now we're stepping out momentarily from the philosopher's position, right, we know from Judaism that God must know everything that he creates, that the creation is not accidental. The creation is with knowledge, right? And in fact, God knows everything. God is omniscient, right? He knows all things. Yes? The truth is that philosophically, this is also not such a problem to prove. You don't even really need the Jewish tradition even necessarily to get to this. It's just faster for our purposes to say that this idea comes from the Jewish tradition. So, God must know everything. Here's the issue. The issue is that when we say know, when we say to know something, right, we are describing one thing that our soul does, right? My soul can dance. My soul can speak. My soul can sing. My soul can love. My soul can hate. And my soul can know. Yeah? I am one person, apparently, and I do all of these different things, right? Including knowing. The problem is that since God must be absolutely one, right, by definition, he must be absolutely unified, it can't be that God has all of these potentials and all of these abilities to do all of these different things, right? For example, there's knowing this table, there's knowing this cup, there's knowing me from the outside, and there's knowing me from the inside. God is omniscient, he has both, right? He knows all things, right? So number one, if there's God and his knowledge, if God is like a human being, right? You have God, and then you have God's faculty of knowledge. You have his ability to know. You have his mind, in simple words, right? You have God and God's mind, right? So there's God, and then there's God's mind, because God doesn't just know, God also acts, right? God also creates. God also changes things, right? God also wills. There's a Ratzon Hashem, right? Which are all different things, apparently, right? So when you say God knows, it's one thing of all the things that God can do. So God has a mind, but God also has a will. And God also has an ability to act.
Almost human.
Like a human being, right? Because we ascribe to God all the highest things, right? More or less. So the problem is that if you have God and God's mind, right, you will need a third thing to explain the unity of God and God's mind. Just as you needed something else to explain the unity of the table's parts, right? Which is a different way of saying that God is not God. Right? You can't have a God who knows who is actually God, because then you'll need some bigger God to explain this God, right? One who actually is simple. Yes? Furthermore, there's even more issues, because even beyond that, when God knows, the things that he knows are made of parts and are changing all the time. So God's knowledge would theoretically also have to be made of parts and changing all the time, right? There's a part of God's knowledge, if it works like human knowledge, then there's a part of it which knows this coffee cup, and now it knows that the coffee cup is over there. Right? This is literally like when I know, me knowing this change, right? My knowledge has changed. I went from a state of knowing one thing to a different state of knowing a second thing, right? But this means that God changes, right? He's changing, which is a different thing. That's also not true of God, right? What comes out from all of this is as follows. You have the Rambam Solution, which is what we just read in Tanya. The Rambam Solution, Maimonides' solution to this issue is as follows. God, the solution is really that we don't know anything about God. That's really the solution. The solution is that all of this is assuming that God is like us, which is a terrible assumption. What? Can't say what? Yeah. All of this is assuming that when God knows, right, he has to know the way we know. When in fact, there's no reason why that should be the case. There's no reason for that assumption to be in place. Why should all ways of knowing be like the way a human being knows, right? When we know, it's us, and then there's our knowledge, and then there's the thing that we know, and it's all in different parts, and you need something else to unite them together, right? Says the Rambam, with God this is not the case. With God, God is the knower, the knowledge, and the known all at the same time, which means, really, translate into simple English, which means we don't know the way that God knows, right? The way God knows is beyond our understanding, but one thing we can say about it is that there's no difference between him and his mind. Right? That we can say, because we need one God, right? The God who's totally unified to explain this table, right? So I'll say God is totally unified, says the Rambam, and if you ask me, but if he's totally unified, how then can he have a mind, right? We'll say, I don't know. His mind works obviously different than ours, and there's no reason to assume that it works the same as ours, right? There's no reason to assume that God has to know with a particular faculty of knowledge. There's no reason to assume that God and his mind are two separate things. God and his mind can be absolutely one thing, which I'll restate in yet a third way. The third way of saying this is very similar to what we say about existence, right? Is that God knows with an unknowing knowledge. Right? God knows, when we say God knows, all we really mean to say is that he's not ignorant. Right? We don't mean to say that he knows, because to say that he knows, just like to say he exists, here's the connection, right, is to say that he knows the same way anything else knows, when in fact he doesn't. He knows in his own unique way, which is totally united with him. So in other words, and we'll continue from this point next week, because there's so much more, and we'll read more of the Alter Rebbe and get into the footnote, and we'll bring this all back eventually to the nature of the soul, right? But in the eyes of the Rambam, when the Rambam says that God's knowledge is totally beyond our understanding, right? What the Rambam means is that when you even say God's knowledge, right, as if it's something other than God, this is just a useful way for human beings to talk about it. In fact, according to Maimonides, according to the Rambam, there is no such thing as God's knowledge. There's only God, right? And there's no such thing as God's will, right, where God wants something. There's only God, right? In other words, God only does one thing, and that's he gods as a verb, right? God gods, and all of the different things that we see as a result, those differences are our issue, not his issue. Right? In other words, we see and we describe God, the one thing that God is and does, with multiple terms, because that's the only way human beings can understand them. But in fact, God is absolutely one. This is what the Rambam says in philosophy. in the commentary on the Mishnah and as Jewish law. It's Jewish law, like Shulchan Aruch, except in the Rambam, right? But it's written as Jewish law. You must know about God. The Rambam says it's required for a Jew to know this about God by law, just like it's a law to put on tefillin, right, and say the Shema. It's a law to know that when God knows, and He knows everything, right, it's not a knowledge that's separate from Him. It's not a knowledge that's a separate thing from God. It's not that there's God in God's mind. There's only God, right? And somehow being only God, right, means He knows everything. He knows everything just by being Himself, by being God simply, right, with no action of knowing and no faculty of knowing, no mind separate from what He is, right? Unlike a human being where what I am and my mind are two separate things. In God, it's all absolutely one in a way that human beings cannot really understand, as the Rambam writes in Halacha, right? This is the philosophical conclusion about the nature of God's wisdom, without any Kabbalah, without any received wisdom. This is what you can know about God's knowledge, starting from the knowledge of the table, right? I start with, all I know is this table, like Avram did, right? All I know is this mountain, or whatever it is, right? This is the knowledge, this is the conclusion you can work your way back to just using regular human logic, right? As we're going to see starting next week when we get into this footnote of the Alter Rebbe, we're going to see that in a way the Kabbalah disagrees, right? But on the other hand, in fact, no one really disagrees. They're all in agreement. It all just depends what exactly you're talking about, right? And this is one of the revolutionary theological points that the Alter Rebbe brought about in his Chassidus, is he brought about a unity between this philosophical view and the view of the Kabbalah, as we're going to discuss. And remember, eventually, at the end of this conversation, this is all about the nature of the mind of God, which is the source of the Jewish soul. Right? That's where we're going with all of this. Once you understand what do we mean by Chachmas Hashem, right? The wisdom, the mind of God, right? Then we can move on with the rest of the chapter and see what it means that the soul comes from that place. So that's the schedule. So we're stopping in the middle of a whole discussion. Next week we'll review and we'll move forward, God willing.
And when you said this word, which I love,